Hello and welcome back to Factorio. My name is Abugnasty. In today's exciting episode, we're going to be going through all the previous winners of the competitions for red, green, and blue science. Why am I revisiting them again? You haven't even finished purple science. Well, first, let me explain. So I currently have some issues with my HVAC system. Specifically, there's a part that is on back order, and I really need that part in order for it not to be abysmally hot in my office where I actually wind up testing and running all the benchmarks. So there was a recent cold front that came through where I could actually go and run some benchmarks finally. So yay! So why am I talking about that? Well, one, currently I'm not able to do and complete the purple science competition until I have a long period where I can run these benchmarks. So for the purple science competition, those usually would run overnight and take 6 to 7 hours to actually complete and run. And I don't currently have a window where I'm able to do that. So for right now, what I'm doing is I'm going to be going through the previous winners of red, green, and blue science. And what I'm going to be doing is testing out each of those with the auto-generated clock from the tool that I just recently released a video on. So go check that out. There'll be a link in the video description below. So the goal is let's go through all the previous designs. Let's see what the auto-generated clocks that get generated by this new tool and how do they actually perform. So I'm going to go and benchmark and do an A/B comparison of the red science, green science, and blue science, each using those new clocking methods. And we'll see, do we get any performance improvement or are they very similar in performance? And if they're very similar, then that means the tool is good. What I'm looking for is just something that is within 1% performance delta. So as long as it's the same, then that means that the tool is good enough for me to be able to go and use and be confident in. So if you're interested in seeing that, stick around and we're going to go do some testing today. Let's start where it all began with red science. So in red science, the main thought process that we had at the time was using lead follower control. So we wanted the ability to monitor and read the contents and include in crafting the items that are currently in the assembly machine. So what this would do is it would monitor the inputs, and whenever they both dropped below that value, it would then send a check mark to go and say, hey, go and insert items into the automation science pack here. And this works out pretty good for red science because, especially since we're using direct insertion here, this can always exactly insert into the assembly machine whenever it happens to drop below. And as long as you have constant back pressure on the fluid, like this is completely fine, and you'll never get into a situation where you're going to run out of material. With belting, this is a little bit more challenging to do correctly because you may, especially since this is less than 15, you could have it accidentally double swing both of these items. So to prevent that, that's why this winds up having this OR condition, and that kind of gets around that case. And this is always picking up items whenever this is greater than 16. So it's always one drop, and that works. So this is across a combination here of 12 assembly machines, even though this is over the actual ratio that we're going to wind up needing, significantly over. You could technically do this with 11 machines, but that is hard from a belting perspective. So what kind of was done originally with this design is we wind up having all the first 5 all clocked here, and then the last one would just top up and be constantly active and dropping one at a time. And then these would just occasionally drop items into it whenever it would actually be low. So this was kind of the original concept on how this particular design worked, and it worked out pretty good. So I wound up throwing this exact same design into the clock generator that I have, and I slightly altered it. The only real differences that you're going to notice here is just that it happens to consolidate these two that are going to be dropping onto this belt, and all of them are clocked. So the way that this particular design works is the difference with the way that the clock that gets generated is you're going to notice that these are doing triple back-to-back swings like this, and they'll then occasionally buffer in its hand a stack of 10 items. You can technically get all the way up to 4 sequential drops because this will be able to put back-to-back swings of copper and iron, because this will very quickly drop below the automated insertion limit. And then you should be able to actually stack up to 64 items in here. given that I'm doing an A/B comparison here, I had a hard time going, and I didn't want to fundamentally alter the design too much in order to make those 4 back-to-back swings happen. So because I couldn't alter the design too much, the problem that I ran into is I didn't have a long enough buffer to do 4 swings. So for that reason, I overrode the configuration to only do 3, which is a feature that the tool offers to do. So let me go and explain how that actually winds up working by showing the configuration itself. So if we come over here and we look at the configuration, you're going to notice that I wound up putting in the amount of items that we have. So there's going to be 480 items per second and 12 copies. What is that? Well, if we look at over here in Factorio, there are going to be, this is basically just modeling this configuration right here. So 2 assembly machines, both of these jumping and throwing items into it. I'm not too worried about the modeling exactly that it's a 2-to-3 ratio and it's staggered like this, because these are going to always have immediately the items that we wind up needing. This is not really a concern. So for that reason, I'm just simplifying it to this is all that I really need to model for this. So then what that then means is if we go back to the configuration, so we've then modeled the 2 machines that are syncing into the 2 automation science packs. We have 12 total copies, and we've entered all the details. I've explained that in the last video if you're curious more about what those values are and how you can get them. So then what we wind up doing is we modeled, okay, from each of the different machines, they're going to drop to a belt, and then also just defining your source and sinks, right? So source going to the destination, and that all those are configured. Then what I wound up doing is I overrode this terminal swing count. So that's saying I want 3 target drops from the terminal machine, which is our red science assembly. So if I turn this off and I show this, you'll see that it's going to try to opt for actually doing 4 swings. And then kind of because of the fact that the automated insertion limit is going to take some time to consume that very first iron gear wheel, it waits a little bit before it does the next swing, which makes kind of sense because of the way that this is staggered and set up. The problem that I just had was just that, okay, I can't actually go and with just the belt routing of the original design, I couldn't do 4 swings. However, I could get 3 swings to work. So I just wound up saying, all right, I'm going to choose 3 instead, and then just regenerate the blueprint config. And then what it does here, you can see that same pattern where it does back-to-back swings here. But what it does instead is it only does 1 for the first time, and then back-to-back, because now we're doing a 3 pattern. And what you're going to see as well is when you saw it holding those 10 items in its hand, you're going to see here that it's going to go and pick up either 2 or 10 or something like that. So you can see that it's enabled for a little bit longer to go and pick up that last buffer as the machine goes and starts working again. So it grabs that last swing. So it recognized that, did that accurately. So I wound up copying this configuration, and then I wound up taking this into the game here and just copying and pasting this. Now, because the configurations here for gears and copper have the exact same tick timing, all I did is I just consolidated this down just to 1, just to reduce the number of combinators we have, and then just wound up just connecting these simply, and then pasting this onto here. And that's effectively all that I wound up doing for this. So let's go and talk through the results of this particular benchmark as I compared this version to this version. So here you're seeing an example of the save file itself that was used for the clocked version. And here are the results itself. So the red gen clocks is the version you're seeing below. Right now, that version performed about 1.4% better, or 1.5% better if you round, than the old version. So what was I expecting out of this? Well, what I was hoping was that the difference would be almost negligible. So I was hoping that the difference between the 2 different control methods would be almost nothing, and especially that it wouldn't be worse. Because that means that at least the tool generating the clocks has done a decent enough job about getting it about as close as the original clocks that were created. So that means that for us, in this particular case, there's some expected things. So I was expecting the entity update time to go down because we are controlling when the inserters are interacting with the belt, and there are no inserters that are constantly dropping. So that I was expecting to go a little bit down. I was also expecting control behavior update time to go down, which you also see dropping from 97 to 92. So As a first litmus test, this seems like, okay, the clock generator does do a decent job in creating a good enough clock for what we're wind up using in this save file that was here, and performed just slightly better than the last one, but I would consider them to be about equivalent. So let's move on to Green Science. So what you're seeing here is the original version that was hosted in the competition. There were 2 winners. I've chosen this one as I wanted to use this as the testing example. They were deemed to be equivalent, so I wound up using this one. The other one that exists here is the version 1.1 and also version 1.2. Now I'll explain the differences between them. But basically the way that this is done is this particular version uses the lead follower concept and used set filters on the input on these inserters to get around the fact that sometimes you're going to have 16 items, sometimes you're going to be dropping and you'll have 14, and so it always just makes sure that it's always dropping as consistently as it can 16 items at a time out of the machine. And this gets you around a lot of the desync problems. So this is traditional kind of lead follower control, looking at the items, making sure it's never output blocked, and then having a good decision about it being less than 12, which is a good decision because that's going to be under the automated insertion limit of 14. However, there is a problem with this particular build if you start it cold. And this is just one of the issues if you use set filters in general on the output. So let's go ahead and just speed this up a little bit so that we can see the Green Science coming out. And then I'll show kind of the case here by just stepping step by step here. So you can see that the sciences that happen to be over here on the left-hand side are fully stacked all the way up to 4. But there's this random one that has a stack size of 2. So why does that happen? Well, until there's full back pressure on this line for the actual inserters that are coming down the line, you're going to occasionally miss a swing. And if that happens, these will get out of sync. And they'll get out of sync based on the timing to the fact that you will wind up having just 2 science packs in here. This will pick up those 2 and will drop them whenever the filter goes away, because that's the nature of set filters, is the moment that the filter goes away, it drops whatever it has in its hand. And so in that case, because this will consume 1 input and create 2 on the output per craft, that will just always happen on a cold start, that if those items are picked up and the set filter ends before the next craft can happen, then all the items on that belt will have 2 or 4, and eventually that will go away. If you run the build long enough, it will stabilize, and it will get to the point where it's always stacked up to 4 once you have full back pressure on this line. However, that being said, the issues that kind of come about from that is that you have to be a little bit more mindful of how you initialize your build. So specifically, if I wound up just running this on a cold start and then feeding it directly into the clocked labs that I have, they will desync and they will break because they're not expecting to pick up 2 items at a time. So for that reason, you're going to have these kind of like unevenly stacked belts and it'll never go away. So you have to deal with it in some way. And the easiest one is just to let the back pressure completely fill up and then start the next assembly line, which is something that we saw in a lot of these builds that did some clever things about preloading the assembly machines with like 4 items or 2 items to always get you around the desync behaviors that exist. So clocks kind of solve all of those problems. So for example, if I start this build here on a cold start, you'll notice that there will never be any stacked items that are not fully stacked up to 4 items here. It'll take a little bit longer for it to initialize, but they're always stacked up to 4 and perfectly synchronized from the left and right side. And that's because we're using the fact that the stack inserters always pick up 16 items as a feature rather than a problem that we have to deal with. So what this does is this will hold in its hand and will always drop 16 items. So that gets us around the first problem that exists. And we're not using set filters anymore. I just happen to say use filters here just for the visualization purpose, but it just sends a signal here to turn on and off and then to drop them. And so even if we miss some swings waiting for back pressure to be established, the inserter will just wait until the next crafting period for it to go and drop those items out of it, which is one of the nice things about clocks themselves over the original lead follower, and especially with setting filters, is although this works, it gets you around that initial problem and allows you to just start the build, copy and paste it without any worries at all. So in my case, this is already an improvement just from that feature alone. Now, what you wind up seeing here is I wound up putting this into my clock generator and I said, cool, let's go and use that. And that's what it's created here. Very similar to the Red Science configuration. It's using the exact same concept and is now using 2 swings on the output, which it determined itself and figured out it could do. So no other manual intervention was done on it. This was just copy and pasted, and we used the same design as close as possible as we could to this design. The only difference is I cleaned up some of the power arrangements here and then removed the extra controls that went from these inserters dropping into here. And that's just mainly because I wanted to have truly just clocks only in this build and no lead follower design, and I didn't find it useful, even though I did model the system with this. I didn't find it useful to go and clock these inserters going into here because it would create a much larger loopback time for the actual clock. And I just found that the extra conditions are probably just not worth it to have these switching into here. And since they just very, very occasionally will actually wind up ever having to wake up and drop, and the crap completes in like basically 1 tick, I'm not worried at all about these needing to be clocked. So that was the reasoning for why these weren't clocked. Now, the build below, which I'm calling version 1.2, this version here, I wind up saying I want to challenge a paradigm that existed in the original competition. So in the original competition, what was decided and agreed upon by most people, and that, well, at least the conclusion that I came to, was that it's better to not clock this system whatsoever. And the reasoning being was because these so occasionally will just have to just wake up and drop items in, and you can get around it. And the reasoning was, hey, it's a 3-to-1 ratio, so let's just grab 3 inserters in here. This will always just drop the items exactly at ratio, and we should be able to be just fine, and everything should anyway look like they're synchronized, and then just wait. So if you go and you wind up doing just 1 inserter though, however, you're going to see a lot more just kind of like wakeless flickering that kind of goes on between these two as they desync, trying to go and find items to put in here. And they wind up also having occasionally kind of like more of an impact where this winds up picking up a half of an item sometimes. And very occasionally that will happen. And that's because this is slightly underclocked here, as you can see. So at ratio here, this particular design, this is not enough to meet the actual output demand, but we know by nature that this is going to only need to be producing 60 items per second and not the 124 that it could possibly make. So it means that occasionally sometimes you'll wind up having that this will pick up and run out of items in the middle of a crafting cycle if you don't use these 3 inserters. So what I wanted to challenge was, can we create a clock that can control it with that 1 inserter going in and 1 inserter here, and actually clock the whole entire system? Now, this is a lot more challenging to do because you need to know the ratios, get this all to go in exactly when needed, and always have a constant amount of back pressure that's going to be needed in here. And also you have to honor that the timing in which this is running so that you always have 16 items for both of these 2 inserters, one that's going to be dropping items into here, and the other one that's going to be dropping items into the green electronic circuit machine. So what I wound up saying was, well, let's just go ahead and test the clock generator with that as well. So that's exactly what I wound up doing. So here's a configuration that actually lists out all the individual components. So the inserter, electronic circuits, every single individual item, and then all the inserters and their relationships as they go back and forth between them. One of the things that I wound up doing was I overrode the configuration to always insert copper wire and do the same thing over there. And the reason was because the least common multiple of this would drag this out to a very, very large range. And I said, this is going to be good enough. I'm just going to say always, and I will clock it this way. That way I have more samples. And I also wound up saying I'm going to override the tick range for the machine to only be dropping a total of 3 swings, so 32 ticks. So I did wind up manually overriding these 2, just because the way that it would work out was I wanted to shorten specifically the least common multiple and the overall clock range. So you're seeing that by nature, going and changing a few of these things and manually controlled and then keeping everything the same. When I wound up going and generating the blueprint for this, it winds up going and creating this very weird looking pattern here that is dropping at different times and for different inserters. And you can see that this is kind of looks like it's all over the place. However, the nice thing is that it does do a pretty good job of doing one swing altogether and then doing 4 swings back to back of copper. And you're seeing that here where it kind of does this and then kind of buffers this out over time. So this is a very long clock, so to speak, but it winds up actually creating all of the items that we wind up needing and does it in a way so that we are always outputting 48 items, so 4 swings back to back to back of the inserters. And so when we look at the clock and what it wound up actually generating, it did a pretty good job of being able to have the full wraparound condition. And you can see that this belt completely stops just in time for this inserter to pick up the items. So this is actually always interacting with a non-moving belt because this is exactly clocked to have these number of swings that are coming out of it. So the one thing that I wound up changing here is you can see that this is a very large timer here, but it's to compensate for the fact that this one is going to be every 528 ticks and this is every 192 ticks. And so this is the least common multiple of 528 and 192. So that is going to get us to 2112, and that is the value there. And the reason that is important is so that the start and stop times of this whole sequence is exactly the same, so that this inserter can exactly pick up those items and stop exactly at the right time. Because if this is out of sync or out of phase from each other, and this drops a little bit too early or a little bit too late, then this inserter will interact with a moving belt, and that's what we don't want. That's not a good scenario. But right now, I do have wake lists enabled, so you can see the debug menu, and we're seeing that this is actually perfectly clocked and runs completely without any wake lists appearing whatsoever, and all the inserters can just interact and drop. So I was actually really mind blown that it could figure this out just based on the rules that exist right now. So that is version 1.2, and let's go and talk through the results and see if clocking this, even though the original ideas were that this wasn't as good, but I'm curious now if, because we can clock this appropriately and drop down to 1 inserter, is it actually better than the original version here? And is this version better than the original as well? So let's go and compare all 3 of those designs. So what you're seeing below is version 1.2 and the actual save file that I used for benchmarking. Now for cinematic purposes, I made this in the nighttime. However, during the actual runs, the time is always locked to the middle of the day so that you don't have any particular render effects that are happening because it happens to be nighttime. So let's talk through the results. So what you're seeing here is version 1.2, 1.1, and the old ones. So the very first one that shocked me when I ran this was just how much of a difference there is between the control behavior update times between the old version and version 1.1. You can see that it drops from 110 down to 71. That's a pretty substantial difference, and you can see that it kind of drops in terms of its control behavior update time. And additionally, the entity update time was actually better on the old one, but overall that reduction in the two wound up making it so that it wound up being just overall better. So it wound up being a 3.6% difference between them. Pretty confident in these results because the electric fluid circuit update time and then also the overall other category are exactly identical in these particular benchmarks, so with a slight variance. So then that means that I'm pretty confident in the results themselves. But what's interesting just to notice is that the fluid update time actually goes down on the original one, just compared to the old one as well. But mainly you can start seeing more of a balance where it winds up reducing substantially the control behavior update time because we don't need to use set filters and we don't need to send one value at a time to drop one time for the outputs of the green science. So instead we can do 2 back-to-back swings. Then what surprised me even further was the substantial entity update time drop that came from actually going and clocking the inserter assembly machine factory. So when we went to version 1.2, and this is actually goes against some of the results that we had in the competition because the conclusion there was that it was better to just not clock the green circuit assembly at all. However, this very much proves the opposite, and this goes and does again another 3% difference, showing that although it does increase slightly the control behavior update time, the entity update time drops substantially. for actually going in and clocking the asserter assembly machine factory itself. So that was actually a really nice find. And the nice thing that comes out of this is that the main reason that we didn't do these kinds of clocking exercises was just due to the complexity. So going and figuring out all the timing is just painful and takes a really long time. And so that's one of the benefits of using a tool like I've created, is that it can get us to a point where it will produce a good enough result with some manual intervention that we had to do. But it gets us close enough to getting something that can have a real impact that actually wound up being 3% better in this particular case. So that means that we actually got an overall 6% improvement by using this tool over the original clocking methods that were created by hand, and originally also using lead follower. So I thought that was a pretty cool and interesting result. So next, let's talk about Blue Science. So in the competition, this is actually the design that I wound up creating in the end. So this is actually when I first started to try to understand some of the clocks that originally Thaon had proposed, and a lot of these methods came from his original doc that he posted on my Discord. And actually a lot of the clocking methods that I have built into the calculator tool comes from him. So I've at least a lot of the methodology that was done there. So and trying to take kind of like his brain and some of my own understandings of the game mechanics and throwing it into this tool. So just shout out to him just for figuring out a lot of these clocking concepts. So what you're looking at then here is the original approach that I had taken to creating these clocks. Before I really understood how they worked, the way that I did this was I based it on the machine speed and not the actual target output production rate. And so for that reason, I created this very, very long buffer belt that is on the outside here of this transport line that winds up just topping this belt off all the time because this will eventually have a desync that will occur eventually when this belt buffer completely backs up. It happens very, very infrequently, but just like there, where it just winds up having a desync and will then reconnect and will start producing again. So this long buffer is good enough to basically solve the problems that you're going to have from overproducing. So this build overproduces slightly, so it intentionally goes at the full 121.1 per second instead of the 120, which is the target of the machine down here. So the clocks, when I wound up generating them, is over here is the configuration for that. So I wound up going and saying here the target is 120, there's 11 copies, and a very similar thing where we have 2 chemical science machines on the output and in the engine machines, and they're picking up from a belt in this particular case, and I've defined those belts. And here was the overall configuration that it wound up coming up with, a 352 tick clock, and that was put in. Now the tool itself, one of the things you're going to notice is these extra little wake lists that kind of come up. The tool is trying to be a little bit safe in terms of how its clock that it's generating is going to come out. And so what it does is it intentionally creates a slightly longer buffer for some of these inserters. So what you're going to notice when these run is these occasional wake lists that stay a little bit longer active. And this is mainly to prevent some of the desync problems that occur. And now you could probably optimize this by manually changing some of the timing variables to cut them off a little bit. But what I've kind of found is that I'm curious if it even makes any difference at all, because you're going to see that this isn't there isn't a second flick that's happening. So in other words, it's not waking up a second time. There isn't an extra condition where it happens. And it's because the buffer is kind of set up in a state where the buffer is going to wait specifically for that extra amount of time. We'll just wait the time that it takes to craft an extra item potentially, and then divides that in half. So, and then at a maximum, it's going to have 2 ticks. So what it's trying to do is just like, hey, just in case this one's slightly offset from this one, let's just go ahead and just wait a little bit extra, 1 or 2 ticks, and then go grab that item, depending on what it is. So that means is that they stay registered in the global wake lists for the game a little bit longer than they would otherwise with the clock setup that's done over here. So you see that there is absolutely no wake lists, everything is perfectly synchronized, but then you do have this one that's just slightly out of phase, and then it needs this long buffer belt. This doesn't at all, and so because we're properly clocking this, we can use a lot less of these kind of side loads that are happening, and we can use a much longer belt for that reason. So those are just some differences. Now, one of the things that I tried to do was I tried to actually use a clock generator to build this out. And I'll show you how absolutely terribly wrong that went. The main reason, if you really want to clock this properly, you're going to need most likely some kind of we'll put it this way, you're going to need something that is going to be a fractional clock. And the reason for that, or a subtick clock, because of the amount of conditions you're going to need to satisfy the least common multiple is just going to be absurdly large. So you can see here that it generates a cycle duration of 42.6 ticks, 469.3 ticks, which is usually an indicator that, hey, you probably need a subtick clock because your cycle duration is set up in such a way where you have a fractional output. That means I'm going to need, from each of these, we are going to be needing to produce 45 items per second. And the actual output is then going to be 42.66 ticks is when the swings need to happen. In this case, it's targeting to try to do 2 swings per cycle. So to fully actually get around it and do a proper swing, you'd need the least common multiple of 16 and 45, which is a large number. So that's where a subtick clock would work out really well. And that's one of the limitations of the tool, is that it doesn't support this really well. And so you can see here that it will pick up sometimes constantly from the machine, and I tried to generate it. And although the actual output is like okay, it just can't perform exactly correctly. So this is a work in progress, and subtick clocks is something that is substantially more difficult to go and program. So what I'm doing for now is I am going to say I am not going to solve that problem. And so for that reason, I've punted on that decision and just let it go and rely specifically here on the original control logic that was using latched lead follower control. And that actually works out really well because in this particular case, the guide that is going on is this is all set to an exact clock. So the consumption rate is exactly synchronous. So that actually, by nature, will balance the left and right sides of this build. And it actually creates a really nice feature that comes from this all being clocked, is that because I had set this up originally to run at the max production rate of these machines rather than at the fixed consumption rate that these really need to produce, which is 90 per second, this would actually consume slightly more than that. So that 0.79 makes a difference. And I had to set this up with a condition here that would wait until the advanced circuits are saturated. Because if you don't do that and you leave this off, I'll show you what winds up happening to this build. So this was a big problem with the way that I had originally tried to clock this. This will never stabilize. And that's because of, well, it actually doesn't. It never actually stabilizes because it gets completely desynced. Even if you wait completely for this whole buffer to be filled up, you're like, okay, great, everything looks good. And then eventually this buffer will run out, and this would get to the point where this is desynced. So, and it won't show its case now, but occasionally, like, this performance of this was slightly worse. So the way to deal with it was to basically say, hey, let's just wait until everything is backed all the way backfilled with the red circuits like this, and just wait until the red circuits stop producing, come all the way back here like this, and then we just go and enable the build. And then it would instantly produce the result that we wanted and wouldn't have any desync problems. The build on the bottom, though, because it's been generated using the new clocking tool, doesn't have any of those problems. You can just start it up, and it will very quickly get to the point where it synchronizes and is completely in step, and everything is synchronized. And you'll see here that it always picks up 12 or in this case 14 items, I think it is. In this case, I think it's 12. Actually, no, it's always 12 items that it comes back with. Yeah. So that's what it winds up doing, and it actually makes it so that we have overall a build that, again, I can just copy and paste, and I don't have to have extra little startup conditions to make sure everything is stable. So that's kind of a nice benefit. Anyway, enough talking about the differences between these two. Let's just go and dive now deep into the actual results of, is this as good even with these extra little wake-up lists? I don't think they will be, but I haven't been able to actually know until we actually go and test it. So let me go and run the test now, and we can go and see. When I said I'm going to run the tests now, I really meant I'm going to run them now. There was an issue originally with the original test files that I noticed while I was recording this, and it had to do with the outer edge of the science design just not having a long enough buffer range to actually go and supply it. So in the tests themselves, the design that you're seeing in front of you wound up not actually producing the full amount of chemical science. So had to rerun them. And with that, here are the results from that test run that I just ran. So the interesting part of this is right away you can see that the control behavior update time winds up being exactly identical, 108 and 108 microseconds between the two. That makes sense because in these tests, the number of signals that the clocks are sending, because they're both clocked builds for the thing that's changed, is exactly the same. The difference is the period of the clock. So the blue old clocks was, again, clocked to the speed that the machine can produce. The new one, the blue generated clock, produces to the production rate that we want. So this is 120 items per second versus 121.8. So that means that we can do some nice things with this particular build that reduce the transport line update time from 91 microseconds down to 85. And that's creating these small little buffer channels that you're seeing on the right and left hand side of the screen, instead of the small individual constant. So for each inserter having a dedicated transport line that would go to the main, now we share that across 3 different assembly machines. And that works now because we are clocking exactly at the production speed that we want, and they will never collide now, which is kind of a nice thing because of this clock. Additionally, we can also have some more resting time for the actual assembly machines every once in a while. So per cycle, it's like 1 tick or so that they can actually wind up resting. So that also reduces their entity update time. But that's kind of the observations that I've seen from this. And it's, again, kind of a nice thing to see that the generated clock, even though it has these extra wake list events that you're seeing, wound up performing about 2% better than the original version. Now, the goal again of this whole entire experiment was not to see if the clocks are better, it was actually just to see if they're equivalent. So in this case, because they're actually proving to be slightly better than, or in every single case, that gives me really high confidence that this tool works, at least for the designs that we've tested. If you made it this far in the video, first, thank you so much for your attention span and watching all the way through the entire video. I will be continuing to try to do as many benchmarks as I can, given my current limitations that I have with the HVAC system. But with all that being said, I am very excited for continuing to test out this tool. We've been testing it out with some different other designs in my Discord channel, so come and hang out there if you want to get some help using the tool and also experimenting with it. I really appreciate the people that have already tested it out. I've already made a whole bunch of improvements since I last talked about the original version of this tool, and I'm excited to see what the future holds as well. Additionally, fun fact, if you've made it this far in the video, what you're seeing in front of you right here is actually all those designs all merged together. And what you're seeing is that, actually I found out, is that they all tile really, really nicely together. So they all tile almost exactly perfectly, except I still need to make this correction that I was talking about before that would fix some of the occasional starts and stops of this design. But anyway, side tangent aside, it's pretty cool to see how these designs are kind of evolving to the point where they can tile really, really nicely. So in theory, you can have a giant block like this that produces 56,000 science per minute, or 4 stacked lanes of red, green, and blue as one tileable build that you can do. So you can just keep on stacking them. And if you create effectively this whole entire setup here, that's exactly my entire base. My entire base currently uses this amount of science. So this, in theory, if I wound up actually going and putting this into my actual base, this would be the entirety of what I would have to put down. So pretty cool to see where these designs are evolving from. Anyway, I will have all the results that I posted in a written form, as always, in the video description below, and you can go check those out. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. My name is Abuck Nasty. Have a fantastic rest of your day.